The world knew Gene Simmons as the Demon, the fire-breathing bass player who built a rock and roll empire with calculated precision. But on October 17th, 2025, one day after Ace Frehley's death, Gene Simmons sat alone in his Los Angeles mansion and played a cassette tape he had kept hidden for 43 years. The recording device clicked on, and what emerged from those magnetic strips would shatter everything the world thought it knew about Kiss, about friendship, and about the price of fame. Gene's hands trembled as he listened to his own voice from 1982, speaking words he had buried deep in his conscience, words that now echoed like accusations from a grave he had helped dig. Before we continue with this story, if you want to hear more untold stories from rock and roll's darkest corners, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. The truth doesn't wait for anyone. The tape began with studio noise, the ambient hum of Electric Lady Studios in New York City, March 1982. Gene Simmons's voice came through clearly, talking to someone off microphone, someone the world would never know existed. A lawyer, a fixer, the kind of person who made problems disappear in the entertainment industry. Gene's words on that tape were measured, businesslike, devoid of the theatrical bombast he showed the world. He was discussing Ace Frehley, his bandmate of 9 years, his brother-in-arms who had helped build the Kiss empire from nothing to a $100 million franchise. But Gene wasn't talking about helping Ace with his struggles. He was talking about removing him, surgically, permanently, from the equation. The tape revealed a side of Gene Simmons that contradicted every public statement he had ever made about loving his bandmates, about Kiss being a family, about loyalty being sacred. Gene had told the lawyer that Ace's increasing unreliability, his addiction issues, and his creative differences were threatening the entire Kiss machine. But it wasn't just about business. On that tape, Gene admitted something darker. He said that Ace's 1978 solo album, which had outsold both Gene's and Paul Stanley's solo releases, had created a problem. Ace had proven he didn't need Kiss. He had shown the world that the space ace could fly without the demon and the star child holding his wings. And for Gene Simmons, a man who had built his entire identity on control, on being the mastermind behind the greatest rock band in the world, that success was intolerable. The tape captured Gene saying, in his own words, that they needed to create a situation where Ace would want to leave, where he would feel so isolated, so unsupported, that walking away would seem like his only option. They would cut his songs from albums. They would dismiss his creative input in production meetings. They would schedule recording sessions when they knew he was struggling. They would, in Gene's words, make him feel like a ghost in his own band. But the tape didn't stop there. Gene had kept recording, documenting the systematic dismantling of Ace Frehley's place in Kiss. Throughout 1982, every slight, every dismissal, every creative rejection was part of a deliberate strategy. When Ace brought in guitar riffs for the Creatures of the Night album, Paul Stanley would politely listen and then use session musician Vinnie Vincent's parts instead. When Ace asked about tour planning, Gene would schedule meetings and forget to tell him. When Ace tried to discuss his percentage of merchandise sales, the lawyers would send him incomprehensible contracts designed to confuse rather than clarify. The cruelty wasn't loud or obvious. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts, each one small enough to seem accidental, all of them together forming a pattern of deliberate exclusion. The tape revealed that Gene had even orchestrated moments that fans later remembered as Ace's failures. There was a concert in Detroit, July 1982, where Ace's guitar kept cutting out during his solo. Technical difficulties, everyone assumed. But Gene's tape told a different story. He had instructed the sound engineer to create intermittent problems with Ace's signal, subtle enough to seem like equipment failure, obvious enough to make Ace look incompetent. Gene laughed on the tape as he described how Ace had smashed his guitar in frustration, how the newspapers had written about Ace's erratic behavior, how it all fed the narrative they were building. Ace Frehley was becoming unstable, unreliable, a liability. And when he finally left Kiss in December 1982, the official story was that it was a mutual decision, that Ace needed to focus on his health, that the band wished him well. Gene Simmons had told that lie for 43 years. He had sat through interviews praising Ace's contributions, expressing concern for his struggles, saying he hoped Ace would find peace. He had participated in reunion tours in the 90s and 2000s, standing beside Ace on stage, playing the old songs, pretending that everything was water under the bridge. And all the while, that tape sat in a safe deposit box in a Los Angeles bank, a confession that Gene couldn't bring himself to destroy, but couldn't bear to reveal. Now, with Ace gone, Gene Simmons faced a choice that had haunted him since October 16th. Hours before Ace's death, something extraordinary had happened. Ace had called Gene. It was the first phone call between them in over 2 years, since their last bitter argument about money, about legacy, about who really built Kiss. Gene had let it go to voicemail. He was in a business meeting, discussing a new Kiss licensing deal, and he figured whatever Ace wanted could wait. It could always wait. That voicemail, which Gene listened to 17 times in the 24 hours after Ace's death, contained 6 words that changed everything. Ace's voice, weak and raspy, struggling through whatever pain was consuming him, said this, and only this. "Gene, I know about the tape." How Ace had found out about its existence, Gene would never know. Perhaps someone from the studio had talked. Perhaps the lawyer, now dead for 15 years, had kept his own insurance policy. Perhaps Ace had always suspected, had spent 43 years feeling the truth in his bones even if he couldn't prove it. But those 6 words confirmed that Ace had died, knowing he had been betrayed by the man he had trusted most. Gene Simmons, the calculating businessman who prided himself on never showing weakness, broke down when he heard that message. Not in public, not where anyone could see, but alone, in his mansion, surrounded by gold records and platinum plaques and all the markers of his success. He wept like a child. The next day, Gene retrieved the tape from the bank. He sat in his home studio, the same studio where he had recorded bass tracks for dozens of Kiss albums, and he listened to his own voice plotting against his friend. Each word was a nail in a coffin he had built decades ago, a coffin he had convinced himself was necessary for the greater good of Kiss. But listening to it now, with Ace freshly dead, the justifications sounded hollow. They sounded like exactly what they were. Excuses, rationalizations, the desperate reasoning of a man who had chosen empire over brotherhood. Gene Simmons had told himself for 43 years that he had done what was necessary. Kiss had survived Ace's departure. They had continued making albums, touring the world, building the brand into something that transcended music. They had become a corporate entity, a merchandise machine, a cultural icon. And all of that success, Gene believed, justified the methods he had used to achieve it. Ace's solo career had been respectable but modest compared to Kiss's continued dominance. Gene had proven his point. The machine was bigger than any individual member, but the tape revealed something Gene had never admitted publicly, something he had barely admitted to himself. He missed Ace. not the troubled, addicted Ace of the early 80s. He missed the Ace from 1973, the guitar player who had auditioned for Kiss with a battered Les Paul and an amplifier held together with duct tape, who had created the Space Ace character with childlike enthusiasm, who had stood beside Gene through the brutal early years when Kiss played to empty clubs and survived on fast food and dreams. On the tape, buried beneath the cold business calculations, there was a moment where Gene's voice softened. He was talking to the lawyer, explaining why Ace needed to go, and suddenly he paused. The tape captured several seconds of silence, then Gene saying something he never said in public. He said that pushing Ace out would haunt him, that he knew it was wrong, but that he didn't see another way. He said that Paul Stanley agreed it had to be done, that Peter Criss had already been pushed aside, that this was just business. But his voice broke slightly when he said it. For just a moment, Gene Simmons the Demon disappeared, and Paul Klein from Queens, the kid who had changed his name and built a persona to hide his vulnerability, admitted he was about to destroy something he loved for the sake of something he loved more: his empire, his control, his legacy. After listening to the tape 3 times, Gene Simmons did something he had never done in his entire career. He picked up his phone and called a journalist he trusted, someone who had covered Kiss for decades, someone who understood the nuance between public persona and private truth. He told the journalist he had something to confess, something that needed to be said while the words still mattered. The journalist arrived at Gene's house that evening, expecting perhaps a standard tribute to Ace, some carefully crafted PR statement about loss and legacy. Instead, Gene led him to the studio and played the tape. All of it. Every damning word, every calculated cruelty, every moment of premeditated betrayal. When the tape ended, Gene looked at the journalist and said something that would have been unthinkable 48 hours earlier. He said he wanted the tape released. Not immediately. Not as some ghoulish cash grab or attention-seeking scandal. But eventually, when enough time had passed, that people could understand it as a confession rather than an attack. He wanted the world to know what he had done to Ace Frehley. He wanted Ace's children, now adults with their own complicated relationships, to their father's legacy, to understand that Ace hadn't failed Kiss. Kiss had failed Ace. Or more specifically, Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley had failed him. They had taken a talented, troubled man, and instead of helping him, they had used his vulnerabilities against him. But Gene's confession came with a caveat that revealed the complexity of his character. He told the journalist that he didn't regret everything. He regretted how he had done it, the cruelty of the methods, the coldness of the execution. But he didn't regret that it happened. Because Kiss had survived. Kiss had thrived. And in Gene's utilitarian calculation, the suffering of one man, even a man he loved, was worth the joy Kiss had brought to millions of fans over the decades. It was a monstrous equation, and Gene knew it. But he stood by it anyway. That was the true horror of the tape. Not that Gene had betrayed Ace, but that even now, even with Ace dead and the truth exposed, Gene still believed he had made the right choice for the wrong reasons. In December 2025, Gene Simmons attended a private memorial for Ace Frehley held by Ace's family in Connecticut. It was a small gathering, maybe 40 people, nothing like the public celebration of Ace's life that had been held at Madison Square Garden weeks earlier. Gene sat in the back, wearing a simple black suit, no makeup, no costume, just an old man paying respects to another old man who had died too soon and too sad. Ace's daughter spoke about her father's struggles and triumphs, his love of guitar, his childlike enthusiasm for space and science fiction that had inspired the Space Ace character. She talked about his later years, his sobriety, his peace with the past, his acceptance of his legacy as something both glorious and tragic. When the memorial ended, Ace's lawyer approached Gene and handed him a guitar case. Gene opened it there in the funeral home, and inside was the Les Paul, still beautiful after 50 years, still covered in the silver finish that had reflected stage lights in 1,000 arenas. But there was also an envelope taped to the inside of the case. Gene's hands shook as he opened it. Inside was a letter from Ace, written in the weeks before his death, when he knew his time was short. The letter was brief. It said that Ace had always known what Gene had done, that he had figured it out years ago, that the tape existed and its contents were exactly what Gene feared. But the letter also said that Ace forgave him, not because what Gene had done was forgivable, but because carrying hatred and resentment had nearly killed Ace in the 80s and 90s, and letting go of that poison had saved his life. The letter ended with a postscript that broke Gene completely. Ace wrote that despite everything, despite the betrayal and the pain and the decades of complicated resentment, he still considered Gene his brother. Not in the corporate sense, not in the brand sense, but in the way that mattered when they were young and hungry and stupid, playing clubs for nobody, believing they could change the world with nothing but talent and will. Ace wrote that Kiss had changed the world, and whatever the cost, whatever the methods, whatever the sacrifices, that achievement was real and worthy and something they had created together. He wrote that Gene should remember that when the guilt became too heavy, they had made magic together. And magic always requires sacrifice. Gene Simmons will never release the tape. He has decided that much. The journalist who heard it will keep his silence, respecting Gene's right to control his own confession. The letter from Ace remains private, shared only with Paul Stanley, who read it and wept and admitted his own complicity in what they had done. Kiss's legacy will remain largely intact, a triumph of marketing and music and myth-making, a testament to what 4 kids from New York created against impossible odds. But Gene knows the truth, and knowing it, carrying it, living with it every day for the rest of his life is his penance. Ace Frehley died on October 16, 2025, at the age of 74. The official cause of death was heart failure, a common end for a man who had abused his body for decades with alcohol and drugs and the grinding stress of fame. But he had also died, having found peace, having forgiven the unforgivable, having reclaimed the Paul Daniel Frehley that had been buried under Space Ace for so many years. And in that, at least, he had won something that Gene Simmons, for all his wealth and success and fame, would never possess. Ace had died free. Gene Simmons continues to live in Los Angeles, managing his business empire, appearing occasionally in media to discuss Kiss's legacy, maintaining the carefully constructed image of the demon who conquered rock and roll. But at night, in his home studio, he sometimes takes out Ace's Les Paul and plays it quietly, fumbling through riffs he barely remembers, trying to recapture something that existed 50 years ago and can never exist again. The magic they made together. The brotherhood that predated the brand. Gene plays that guitar and remembers Ace, and in remembering, he performs his final penance. Not for the public, not for absolution. Just for the simple, terrible acknowledgement that he loved his empire more than he loved his friend. And that choice, more than any platinum record or sold-out arena, defines who he truly became.